Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Welcome to our Pivot and Win webinar today. And we're very excited. This is a collaboration between Lauda Institute, CTIP, which stands for the West Coast Consortium of Technology and Innovation in Pediatric here with Children's Hospital LA, and Biosciences LA, which is a leadership organization recently formed to implement strategy with the stakeholders here in the county of LA. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the webinar here to our host and moderator, Rohit Shukla, who's the CEO of Lauda Institute. Go ahead, Rohit.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you everybody for joining us in a time of considerable stress for everybody, I'm sure, but it's also a time of great opportunity. You know, the notion of a crisis as an opportunity was first pronounced by Paul Romer, a Stanford economist, who said famously that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. The fact of the matter is we've all discovered in the course of this lockdown that we've been in at different stages in the country, that in fact a tremendous amount of opportunities have also been unleashed. We've discovered, for example, how to communicate with each other while being disconnected from the opportunity to work as a team. We've discovered, for example, the great emphasis on telehealth, the great awareness of global health, the fact that we are an interdependent community globally. We've also discovered that there are tremendous opportunities that come up as a consequence of people's attention being focused on a crisis. But if a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, a pivot is a terrible thing to squander. People have often discovered that pivoting is much more of an art than a science. It does take a lot of emphasis on your assets, your mindsets, your history, your ability to be able to gather resources in a very concerted way. And it also makes it clear that, in fact, not everyone should consider a pivot just because the opportunity presents itself to do so. We're going to be discovering a whole range of issues, or exploring a whole range of issues in this session. I am delighted and honored to be your moderator for this session, and to introduce a distinguished group of people who've done a tremendous amount both during this crisis and before, and will continue to do so after as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce each of the panelists to be able to introduce themselves in terms of their work that they've been doing, in terms of their perspectives on the current crisis, and then we'll get into a discussion that will focus on some of the things that each of them has been able to explore in the last few months, and in particular moving forward, how do we get to a new place, because it is going to be a new kind of world that we inhabit. There will also be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and I would suggest that you put your questions in the chat box. We will be monitoring that, and perhaps even introducing those questions into our chat and our conversation live here on the webinar. I'm going to start with Lilian Chang, who is the president and CEO of Everest Bio. This is a company that has really focused on antivirals, but specifically ones that affect or are able to work with the human protein. Very interesting opportunity that she's been able to discover as well, but also along the way, some observations on what we need to keep in mind. So Lilian Chang, please.
Thanks, Rohit. Just, I guess you just want me to introduce myself, right? Yes, I'm Lilian, the CEO of Everest Bio. We're a drug discovery company. We actually spell Everest E-V-R-Y-S, and that represents our company's vision to develop pills addressing infection that are not just caused by one virus type, but quote unquote every virus. And so unlike traditional therapies like vaccines, our drugs address an infection condition rather than a specific virus. So for example, a lot of viruses can infect the respiratory tract, causing influenza-like illness. And these include influenza A, influenza B, as well as adenoviruses and respiratory syncytial virus. So we have a drug that inhibits all of these viruses, and recently we've pivoted, showing that our drugs also inhibit both alpha and beta coronaviruses. So that's just sort of me right now, but yeah.
And Lillian, where are you located?
We're located in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. We operate in biotech incubator space. It's actually, our landlord is actually the Hepatitis B Foundation, our philanthropic organization.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lillian. We'll get back to you as well with some additional pointers and questions that you might have, or answers that you might have been able to explore in the last few. We'll go on to Dr. Frances Richmond of the University of Southern California. She's the chair of the Department of Regulatory and Quality Sciences. And Dr. Richmond, standing involvement with regulatory and reimbursement issues. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, so my name is Frances Richmond. And I think I don't need to go through that because you've done a lovely job of telling people who I am. Let's just make a couple of points, because what we're here to discuss is really the environment and the changing environment, how that impacts what we do. So I think perhaps as a thing to throw out, we think no one has had to pivot more perhaps than the government, and particularly the regulatory agencies. So that is just a very busy area. And it's a busy area if you have a COVID product, because now the regulators have to really focus on many products. There are over 100 vaccine potential products. There are dozens and dozens of IVDs. There are a whole bunch of PPEs, and in that process, the initial excitement to get things on the market was followed by the excitement, not the negative excitement about them not working. But also we have to think, if you're not making a COVID product, about how that is affecting folks, because those products will have other problems potentially, or other opportunities. For example, we're going to have a lot of difficulty with our sourcing. We're going to have to change our sourcing. We're going to have some difficulties with importing. We're going to have to change our relationships. Our clinical trials cannot be done in the typical way. So we're going to have to look more to telehealth and some of the other aspects to make sure that those can go forward. And I think in each of those is embedded opportunities as well as challenges. And as the Chinese say about crisis, it's opportunity plus danger. And so sort of finding our way and finding where the dangers are and where we can help prevent them may be an opportunity for us.
Wonderful, Frances. Thank you so much. The Japanese also say that in every crisis is a treasured opportunity. So it's a common kind of theme that is picked up around the world. We just have to learn to be able to adapt to those challenges, which are also opportunities as well. And talking about that, let's turn to Patty White, who's the CEO of Hemix Health. This is a medical diagnostics company with a fairly distributed team across the world, but focused on diseases that affect even the developing world. Patty, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. So Hemix Health, as Rohit mentioned, we're really focused on delivering life-changing diagnostics to underserved markets. And I started the company with my co-founder 4 years ago. I'm a serial entrepreneur, although I worked at Hewlett-Packard as an executive for about 13 years before I got into startups, and really hooked on doing entrepreneurial things. I've been in medical technology for about the last 25 years. So at Hemix, we really stepped in to exploit the opportunity that we saw. There were a lot of great ideas, oftentimes starting at universities, but they never made it out to be commercialized, never made it out to the people who need it. So we really focused on licensing a couple of technologies from Case Western, one for malaria and one for sickle cell disease, and really created a platform. Actually, I have this product here, so I can show you. This is our Gazelle platform, which really is like a laboratory in a portable box that we can add other tests to. So we had just released our products for sickle cell and malaria, and we saw this opportunity with that came along with COVID-19. While it created a lot of challenges for our team, because we work in both India and in the US, we're based up in Portland. What we also saw was not so much a need to pivot, but a chance to move into the fast lane and go after this COVID-19 opportunity. So we are working on developing, using our sickle cell basis, our electrophoresis technology, adding COVID-19. So, I'm excited to be here and learn from all of you about how you're moving ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patty. And finally, to my friend Dave Whelan, who's the incoming CEO, the new CEO, I should say, of Bioscience LA, which, as Judy said in the beginning, is a leadership organization set up in the county of Los Angeles to work with stakeholders on making this particular region in this industry more robust and more responsive and more connected. Dave, your observations, you've had a long history with entrepreneurship in a range of different areas, and you've dealt in different geographies as well. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here, and great intro to Bioscience LA. Kind of in the current moment, I actually started my role with Bioscience LA on March 16th. So I think we all remember that was kind of lockdown day here in Los Angeles, and so it's been really interesting, both thinking about how to build a community organization, really connecting a number of other researchers, companies in this moment of lockdown, but also just an amazing opportunity given that we're all so focused on life sciences, healthcare innovation, and with Bioscience LA as a kind of catalyst for growth across the LA region and across a spectrum of technologies from biotech to medtech to digital health to telemedicine. We're really touching on how do we both help companies respond in this crisis. So identifying whether it's opportunities for funding or for space or for talent, how do they address the situation, and whether it's pivot or adjust. But also what's even more exciting to me is as a community organization working with the county, as you mentioned, as well as the city and other government organizations, we're looking at ways that we can actually help get people into training programs, into new jobs in life sciences. So not only helping to move life sciences forward, but hopefully helping to move the economy forward and getting people back to work. And it's truly an exciting time to be working on this, and really excited to be part of this group today.
Thank you, Dave. I just wanted to ask you all a question about the opportunity to pivot, since that's the sort of central thesis of this particular webinar. And you can direct your comments towards your own personal stories, what it is that you were able to see if you decided to pivot, or as Patty said, move into the fast lane, move out of your comfort zone, so to speak. And if you have any tips in terms of the kinds of things you need to keep in mind based on your own experience, please feel free to share those. And we'll start with Lillian again.
Thank you, Rohit. So you can imagine with our technology to develop host-targeted broad-spectrum antivirals that the COVID-19 crisis has provided a ton of pivot opportunities. And believe it or not, I initially responded with denial. And as I sort of waded through, the 5 steps of grief among sort of a bewildering number of opportunities for a company like ours, I can say that I do feel comfortable now about the pivots we've decided to take. But importantly, I've also accepted the ones that we chose not to take, right? And so, so our story is basically, as Dave mentioned, right at the start of this this crisis, actually on March 4th, we held our clinical advisory board meeting because we're discussing taking our drug candidate into the clinic. So we have not initiated, but we're right just before sort of IND enabling studies and so on and so forth. And so we charted a really careful plan to target as our first indication cytomegalovirus infection. Right. And in point of fact, to give you an idea of sort of the timing of this, one of our advisors, who's Dr. Michael Beck, who's at the Fred Hutch, he in fact had to join our teleconference call late because they were responding in Seattle to the cases at the nursing home, and they were meeting, you know, as a, from a public health perspective, you know, what to do in this emergency. And so then as the crisis hit, I was bombarded with investor philanthropy, you know, pharma partnering scouts, basically to ask us, you should be able to have your product ready for use in a year to treat COVID-19. And so I was in denial because we had spent considerable effort to formulate our plan, and I just was not comfortable with these exhortations that, you know, we should be able to quote unquote develop fast because the FDA is lowering its standards, and everybody was looking for a one-year solution. And quite frankly, that's not us. We're a drug candidate in a first-in-class host-targeted antiviral, and I was certain we couldn't be in the clinic in 1 year's time, no matter what shortcuts, all right, the FDA was going to allow us to take. And so to sort of make a long story short, this is where we've landed. We've demonstrated in vitro activity against alpha and beta coronaviruses. These are ones that we can test in our own laboratories because they're BSL-2. And we've lined up and established collaborations to study SARS-CoV-2 in BSL-3 facilities. In the meanwhile, I've positioned ourselves as continuing on our path to treat cytomegalovirus as our first indication. And basically, the positioning is that a regulatory path with cytomegalovirus as our first target indication provides us a path to market for a broad spectrum antiviral that doesn't depend on ongoing COVID-19 for product registration, right? Because in the time frame we're talking about, we don't know if there's going to be cases out there, right? And now that and the good news for us is now everybody understands quote unquote flatten the curve. And so our message to investors and others is that our technology can't address COVID-19 within a year, all right? But in the long run, if we're successful in developing a pill that's broadly effective against many viruses and stockpiled at the start of the next inevitable pandemic, coronavirus or otherwise, we can actually make an impact to flatten the curve, even if it's not 100% effective against the new virus. And so that's sort of in a nutshell our experience over the last few months.
Great, great, Lillian. I think you've got a whole bunch of issues in there. One is the long-term nature of our ability to deal with pandemics, which are not going to go away. They're going to be potentially with us forever. But the second is the issue of regulation and changing regulation, which I want Francis to talk about, and what implications it has for moving forward. There are a lot of companies, including several on this call, who are interested as tech companies, for example, in how they might be able to engage in global health. And Francis, I want you to talk about the changing face of regulation, what it has done in the time of crisis during this particular crisis, and what might be coming downstream. I mean, we've seen regulation, for example, that has been lightened in so many other areas where regulation has always been present. So please talk to those issues, Francis.
Right. I think at the beginning of this adventure in pandemic, the regulatory agencies, as you said, tended to want to lighten and improve interactions, although even at the end of the day, the emergency use authorization that looked like it was going to be flexible, in fact, wasn't really. It said, we really want to see products that are close to being ready. And now they have a task force that is looking at all these products that are coming in that are COVID related and prioritizing them, because they really are swamped with lots and lots of ideas, some real good, some not so good. So that's distracted them. But I think the backstory is the one that comes after you have failures. Okay, after you have chloroquine, after you have testing kits that don't quite work, after you have imports of PPE that don't meet NIST standards. And so the FDA is between a rock and a hard place, because the the expectation is they'll move product really fast. On the other hand, they know exactly who's going to be blamed if the products are not up to standard. So I think that I've seen in the last little while a swing back to being fairly rigorous, and I think that's a good thing, you know, trying to get the best science, but at the same time, trying to figure out how to keep, especially right now, there's a large operation called Operation Quack Hack, because we have a lot of quack products out there. So all of our good products are trying to compete in an environment where we have, you know, chlorine dioxide being, you know, marketed as the miracle mineral solution. And, you know, an administration that likes to try on things that aren't quite proven. So I think that this is, you know, there's a lot going on in the regulatory agencies. And I think for many companies, it's important to realize that some of these things are going to be fairly short term. And in the longer term, you know, there will be companies that optimize these packages, these testing opportunities. But in the long run, we still have diabetes, we still have arthritis, we still have all these other diseases. And in fact, people are now averse enough about going to the hospital that we're having situations where they're starting to look to alternative methods of dealing with those diseases. So those may be opportunities as well. The public may be at a point where they want to take a little more responsibility for their own health, just because they're not so sure right now that they trust going to the healthcare facility.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, by the way, panelists, please just jump in anytime you feel the need to do so, or you have an opinion. And Patty, what Francis was referring to also in terms of other disease conditions, you're familiar with them in the developing world, malaria, for example, which has become something of a cause célèbre with the use of that unmentionable medication that has been in use since the 1940s and is not quite proven to deal with COVID-19. But you've had the opportunity also to assess the global nature of this crisis, and you yourself have moved into, as you said, the fast lane in dealing with opportunities. Could you just comment on some of the things that have been already mentioned by Francis and perhaps Lillian, and related to your own condition?
Sure. I think you know, I really resonate with what both of the other panelists were talking about, because, you know, as a CEO, sometimes your job is keeping your team focused and not going after every shiny ball, because, you know, we know, especially in our R&D team, they love new things. I think for us, when we were looking at this, we were looking at, you know, our target market, you know, the customers we really designed for. You know, we knew, you know, in late February, early March, we saw that they were going to be impacted by COVID-19. In some ways, probably impacted much worse than we might be here, because, you know, there are very vulnerable populations. So they have a lot of underlying conditions. One of our sites in Nigeria that we were talking to this week, I mean, they were having whole families become very, very sick. You know, where generally you would think a lot of younger people would not get so sick from COVID, but, you know, they have a lot of underlying health conditions because they have a poor healthcare system. And we also know that statistically, if you really look at what's projected in the numbers, that more people will probably die of malaria in these countries during this same time frame as they will die of COVID-19. But, you know, what's also happening is a lot of governments are jumping on and knowing they have to politically be responsive and put a stay-at-home program out there, even though people might not be able to have money to buy food because they're staying at home, but they really are trying to be responsive. So we actually felt very early on is that if we could do something, because we knew the best diagnostics were probably not going to go to the small labs in India or the places in Africa, that if we could leverage the fact that we have a good established platform that's low cost, easy to use, you know, robust for the kind of environments that we deal in, they don't need power, that we wanted to try to say, can we use an assay that's already been developed for COVID on our device? And that's when we started running the experiments, you know, using other similar types of assays and having them run on electrophoresis, and discovered that in fact, it really amped up the sensitivity. You know, we were really kind of combining technologies and using a stable platform. So that's where we saw sort of this opportunity for the fast lane. try to get in there. We leverage some of our existing grants from the NIH, where they were allowing you to leverage an existing grant if you had an opportunity, and really started that pretty early. And we still have some work to do, Lillian. Like, it's not like you said, things can't come out next week. It takes some time, but we're really encouraged because we could do something that you could run a test in 4 or 5 minutes. It would cost a couple dollars, and it could be highly sensitive. I mean, that's something that's worth doing and worth investing in as a medical company. Having the right regulatory background so that we could also launch through the regulatory system, not just EUA at some point. So I think we're really thinking about it for the long term. But absolutely, it opened up a lot of funding sources that we didn't even exist to us? 100% yes. I mean, that's the great thing for entrepreneurs. We can move quickly and take advantage of these things. And, I think this is going to shake up the market. I mean, the healthcare market in the US needed to be shaked up a little bit, right? Telemedicine wasn't well accepted. It takes things like this to create all these opportunities for entrepreneurs. So, I'm excited for that because I think it'll help us all in what we're doing. And now, of course, they're even looking at products like ours for the US because they need innovation here too.
So the global nature, both of health and health crises, but also innovation, very important part of the equation that you're involved with, Patty. You talked about the hidden biases in the system that are now going to be finally unearthed and perhaps even worked on because of a crisis like this. Very, very interesting point. Please, we'll elaborate on that further. But Dave, to you, this notion that you should suddenly decide you have to pivot because, as Patty put it, a bright shiny object in front of your face called COVID-19, but there is a BC and an AC, a before COVID and an after COVID, and certain things are going to persist well beyond COVID, regardless of how we deal with the current pandemic. What are your thoughts and tips to entrepreneurs looking at that bright shiny object and saying, God, we've got to have a COVID strategy? Because investors are asking, the first question out of their mouths is, do you have a COVID strategy? And this sort of short-termism and not thinking about the health of your company, right? And where your company is going and what your trajectory is. Go ahead, please comment on that.
Absolutely, and I think what Patty just said is spot on, as well as Francis, in terms of some of the disease areas. This is a perfect time to kind of go back to really business fundamentals and pick your profit. But think about Stephen Covey talking about over the years, important versus urgent, right? And all of us as business leaders, we're constantly looking at our strategy, looking at what our teams are doing and saying, how do we focus on this idea of importance versus urgency? And clearly we're in a moment of urgency right now. And I think that all of us are evaluating our businesses. For me at Bioscience LA, looking at what we do, but in particular, all of the companies in LA, how are they responding? And, I think a perfect kind of simple example is, something like an apparel manufacturer here in LA. I mean, the apparel production capital. And, if you're a bra manufacturer or a t-shirt manufacturer here in LA, and you're worried about keeping your people employed, you absolutely should be making masks because we need more masks and we want to keep people employed. And so that's a great pivot where that's addressing an urgent matter, but it's also important for the health of the business, important for the overall economy. If you are a cancer researcher working on a breakthrough prostate cancer, this is probably not the time to just pause on that and start noodling around with COVID-19, because you've got a lab and some technology to play around with that. Because again, while there is urgency to that, for you as a business, the importance is hopefully still working on prostate cancer. As Francis said, those conditions will be there long after we've tackled COVID-19. And so as any business, I think it's really important to talk to your customers, talk to your investors, talk to your partners, figure out what really needs to be done, and where can you have the best effort right now, which, back to what Lillian said, is all about building for a long-term, long-term future. One more example with that, telemedicine, which I'm elated that after 10 plus years of telemedicine being ready from a technology standpoint, ready from a market standpoint, I think ready from sort of all of the key levers except for the regulatory standpoint. Now these regulations have come down, and telemedicine is booming, which is great. And I think any company that is deep in telemedicine is having a great time. I've seen from Omada to other companies raising money around distance care, telemedicine. They're all raising capital right now because the opportunity is there. But I've also seen other investors who are deep in the healthcare space saying, we're happy telemedicine is a great opportunity, but we're not just dumping money into it because there's already plenty of activity there. Let's actually focus on what's next. And so to me, these are opportunities where you can really, assuming the urgent is taken care of, you've got someone making masks, you have someone focus on tests, this is a great time to really be doubling down on what you should be working on in that in that AC moment, as you're saying, Rohit. What are we doing in 6 months? What are we doing in a year? Where should we be? Because when we come out of this, hopefully stronger, hopefully with more market opportunities, hopefully with more people digging in, we want to be working on the next big thing, as opposed to showing up with ventilator design number 500 a year from now, and everyone's wondering whether we needed this a year ago, not today.
Yeah, so one thing to be very careful about is actually if you don't remember the lessons of history, you will be doomed to repeat them, according to one Karl Marx, right? And the notion that somehow or the other this is going to be able to propel you into a great Valhalla, it's a fiction. I mean, this has happened before, by the way. For those of you that are too young to remember, there was something called the dot-com craze in the 90s, when every single company had a dot-com strategy. 95% of them fell by the wayside. The other 5% had to go back to the drawing board and hat in hand, because frankly, how much dog food could you possibly sell, right? I mean, this is kind of getting to the point of it becoming, the moment the herd starts to run in a particular direction, you need to stop and take cognizance of what's going on around you and then move forward. I'd like to be able to have you folks comment on that, because you obviously have an AC strategy, an after COVID strategy. You've had a BC strategy already. That's not going to change. You simply have a new opportunity in front of you. And this would be for all of you. Francis, you're talking about the changing face of regulation in the interim, in the short term. But there is, in fact, a continuing set of insights that have come out that will keep us moving in the form of, tighter regulation, more defined regulation, and so on, while this Wild West starts to dissipate. So please, any of you, just jump in and comment. Go ahead, Francis.
Let me say something about regulation. And I think sometimes we make the mistake of thinking regulation is consonant with the word FDA. A lot of the regulations that govern healthcare in general are state regulations. And have to be managed state by state. But I do think that, and also CMS, obviously, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, the payers, I think this is a tremendous opportunity to think hard about policy change, not just with the FDA, but with the state regulators, because they're the ones that are going to be able to pay for physicians to use telehealth, for pharmacists to be able to administer testing or vaccines in their clinics. And reimbursement drives it all, right? So healthcare is reimbursed, and all of the regulations that manage how that reimbursement occurs are on the table right now. I mean, there are the opportunities to change those, but that requires quite a lot of diligence and lobbying in ways that maybe we're not quite so comfortable with.
Lillian, Patty?
Well,
Go ahead, Patty.
I think really looking at some of the big changes that are not going to go away as a result of this environment. And, I think that, and trying to look at where when the dust settles, what is the world going to be like? I mean, it's really great that some of the things have been unfrozen around, that may, for example, change the reimbursement methods around telemedicine, or, I don't think hardly anybody is going to think the same way about diagnostics that they thought about 3 or 4 months ago. I mean, diagnostics, in the medical field, it's always kind of been the poor stepchild. It's like, yeah, if you're a biotech company, great. If you're a therapeutic, great. Well, diagnostics, a lot of the VCs said, I don't do diagnostics. But, we all care about diagnostics. My daughter was waiting in London for days and days, very sick, after having spent 2 days with someone who was confirmed COVID. She could never get a test. Eventually they said, this is London, a modern place. And they eventually said to her, you won't get it tested unless you get admitted to the hospital. So they just gave up. I mean, think about that. We've underdeveloped in diagnostics. So I just think those big changes, the whole idea that the healthcare is a global problem, we can't just close the, you care about the next might go further. So I think it's got to make us question about our assumptions that will really change how we go forward.
We'll delve a little bit more into that in terms of individual companies. Lillian, you wanted to jump in here, please.
So I was just going to point out that I just got my blood drawn today to get tested for COVID-19 antibodies, and and I've got to believe that's going to be a challenge for the regulatory agencies now. If people are starting to be willing to pay for tests out of their own pocket. I mean, but I was going to back up a little bit on the in terms of we had kind of ended back with our development strategy, but I will tell you there are things that we fast tracked. So, we are at a stage where we've been also thinking about our next raise to get us through the clinic and beyond, right? And what this crisis has done for us is realizing that the problem is in fact so current, and so we have essentially decided that certain milestones we were waiting for, we're not waiting for them. We're going all in, right, with pharmaceutical companies, with investors. I mean, we're probably speeding up our fundraising strategy by six months to a year, because we realize this is timely for us now. And so there are aspects of this where you do have to move in fast, right? Otherwise the opportunity is gone. And then there's other things you got to kind of look at long term and say, no, we got to stick with our path, and maybe our positioning is different. Yeah.
But you'll never change the issue of long term anyway. You don't expect to. What you're looking at is an opportunity that presents itself that actually applies to things that you would be using in the long term anyway. And that's an important issue to be able to keep in mind for companies. Dave, you and I have talked so much about the influence and impact of tech. And as you know, Silicon Valley itself and the investment community in general, one of the things they talk about is, we think we can apply this to almost anything. We don't have to be a diagnostics company or an antiviral company or a regulatory company focused only on that. We can do it all because this is tech after all. It is the biggest shiny object of all. And there are lots of tech companies currently who believe that they actually do have not just a COVID-19 strategy, aka .com in the 90s, but also one that will survive this crisis and will show us the new path forward. I don't want to be cynical, but I want to be able to have you address that, because you've been involved with so many companies, both tech and non-tech. And what is it that you will tell them?
Yeah, and great, thank you for that. And just back to how you kicked this thing off, as you were talking about the .com, this thing was staring at me. So I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember the pets.com puppet, but which is probably worth more than the entire company is now. But now it's going to stare at me the whole time. But so talk about bad business models. I think there's a couple points in what you're saying. One is that back to my earlier point of just at the end of the day, it really does come down to business fundamentals and understanding how can you make money in a business, and whether it's direct revenue or reimbursed revenue or even foundation funded revenue. It really has to be what is a clear business model. And I think what's actually been very apparent in this current crisis is sort of how fragile some parts of the entire business system are, from sort of the globalization of manufacturing, production, and therefore distribution, where we saw people, 3 months ago we saw people rushing to move production into the US away from China because we were concerned we couldn't get anything. And then by the time we had done that, now we're actually shifting production back to China because they can make things happen, whereas we can't get workers to show up in a factory in the US. And we have no swabs to do certain parts of these tests. But even the entire value chain of if we can solve the development of an amazing diagnostic test. And Patty, by the way, your point about diagnostics finally seeing their day in the sun, I love that, because I'm so much of a diagnostics data technology guy, and I'm not a therapeutics guy. So I love the fact that diagnostics are kind of having this exciting moment. But we can solve the development of the test, but then we're struggling to figure out where can we find enough PCR machines to be able to actually run these tests effectively. Or then you work earlier in the process, where can we find enough sample gathering things, which is really just comes down to, or contact tracing, which is front page right now. Where do we find people to be working to make contact tracing happen, to be collecting samples, to be kind of making sure that we can test people effectively, not just once, but many times over. And so to some extent, there are technology solutions there, but there's also just, basic logistics blocking and tackling. There's the policy that allows this to happen. There's the intersection of privacy with all of this, which, to your point, Rohit, I think in the technology world, everything can be solved with a website and eyeballs showing up for free, and you'll figure out a business model later, and maybe the value is in the user data. When you start bringing in HIPAA and other requirements, or even just basic data privacy that we've been looking at with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and things like that over the past few years, people get very concerned. And so that's not a technology solution, or technology is not the only part of the solution. It is a social solution and a public policy solution, and huge elements of trust, huge elements of communication, all these things that I think a lot of us take for granted. But in the tech world, that's kind of that's a second-class citizen sometimes. And so I think we've really got to keep everyone honest, coming from the federal government and through FDA and into how these things are delivered at the state level, at a local level, where we really understand what are the costs associated with this, and make sure we're doing this right early on, because whatever we're talking about, I think we're going to be living with for a long time. And so we've got to actually take the time to do it right, even though there's an urgent situation. I think the solution is not about the immediate solution. The solution is about a sustainable one.
So Francis, Dave is talking about the changing, in some ways, the changing face of understanding this environment with privacy issues in particular, because I know in certain countries, there's almost a suspension of the expectation of privacy based on the urgency of having to deal with what has become a public health crisis globally. What do you think about, in terms of regulation? Is it going to have to adapt to this new environment in significant ways if it isn't already doing so? What are you seeing on the horizon here? And because that's going to impact, obviously, how companies, including tech companies, deal with this, because there's a whole bunch of concerns around Google Apps, for example, even on contact tracing. What do you think, Francis? You're muted, Francis. We can't hear you. Go ahead.
trying not to interfere with everybody else. I think it's cultural. That's part of the challenge here, is that every culture views their own privacy in very different ways. So Europe already has much tighter privacy regulations than the US, and the US has obviously much looser regulations than China. But we're a global community. So if you're making product, you're going to have to cope with global regulations. You're not going, especially in the telecom space, I would think. Not an expert on that area, but I do think a lot of these things come down to your risk benefit and not going too far overboard in terms of throwing away maybe rights or privileges in the face of a short-term problem, unless you really are sure that that's the right solution, because it can open a door of unexpected consequences. At least that's delicate. That's a cultural thing, and policy is all about not just technology, but about culture and about value systems. And those are things that are shifting as we do this too. I'm seeing people's value system shift somewhat. I think the opportunities come, though, when you look at the pain points of these new, the other day, just to change a little bit, but I was just thinking as I heard some of the others, I'm talking to a colleague at a big pharmaceutical company who said to me, and it really bothered me. She said, we've shelved our clinical trials. We've shelved our clinical trials. And my question is, I didn't ask her because it wasn't my place, but why? Like there are reasons those got shelved, and those reasons are opportunities, because that's a pain point, and perhaps there is a role. There are very specialized outsourcing opportunities in some of these challenges.
Excellent point. Yeah, Patty, go ahead.
I really wanted to say a little bit on this privacy thing, because what's been very interesting to me as we've looked at different countries, if you look at South Korea, for example, how they were so quickly able to control COVID. I mean, they did by March 5th, they had already done 145,000 tests. Set up test centers right away, had people going into them. And during the month of April, they only had 85 people die. And we in the US, we were at the same point that South Korea was at the beginning, at the end of March. We had 85 people dying per hour here in the US. And a lot of the reason I think that South Korea was able to do this was because they had all these concerns about privacy, which we do too. But with MERS, back in 2015, the country got burned pretty badly. And so people changed their mind about what privacy were they willing to give up, where were they willing to be flexible so the government could do contact tracing, because that's what they did. They did diagnostics, they did contact tracing, and they quarantined the sickest people. And they completely changed things. But, I think for us at the US right now, where, every state's doing their own thing, there's really lack of coordinated effort, but we are paying the price. And the question is this going to change how we might think about being ready for the next time?
Well, I think that goes back to the culture issue, right? I mean, very early on for myself, we did a Zoom call with my extended, family, including members in Taiwan, and there's about 30 of us in the U.S. going around all the different windows, the Brady Bunch, right, saying how we were being affected, and and whether we should wear masks, right? So it's probably around March, and at the end, our three, Taiwan extended family, they got on. They were just like, "What are you talking about?" As soon as we heard coronavirus, we had our masks on, right? And even now, I mean, that's totally culture, right? Because wearing a mask has nothing to do with protecting yourself, has to do with protecting everybody in your community, right? And, this is a great country, right? But that's just not part of our DNA. I'm sorry, I mean, it just isn't, So, right? And I'm not even sure that this crisis has changed that, right? I mean, I still, we all bear incredible response. Right? So attitude is, if I'm going to go out there, I'm going to get sick. That's my choice, right? That is my choice. So it's a culture. It's a cultural difference. Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe we are changing. And maybe
one hopes that it goes to becoming one hopes that it stops becoming a symbol of political identity and more a symbol of fashion identity. I've seen some remarkable masks that give you an even better face than you currently have. And one would hope that it becomes a fashion statement. But I mean, it's an interesting point that you make on the cultural issue. I'm just wondering, and I know, Lillian, you're not particularly optimistic on whether things will change in that regard. And I'm just wondering whether the threat of imminent demise will actually focus people's minds more. And we have to obviously look at data and see how data is working. By the way, Patty, you did mention at one point in our conversations about the heightened interest in data. This contrasting with what seems to have become something of, and I don't want to be political here, but I have to say this continued assault on science and fact is something that I think we all have to guard against. Entrepreneurs and others have to always guard against. Be forthright in your defense of the science and defense of fact, because fact is not opinion. Sometimes opinion here masquerades as fact. So, I just wanted to make that comment because I know all of you are dealing with that in one way or the other, and you will be dealing with this as a people game. And when you're looking at distribution channels, you're looking at procurement channels, you're looking at pressures on hospitals, you're looking at pressures on regulators. Look at the FDA and the CDC and what they're going through at the moment with this continued assault on them from all kinds of quarters. So that is a commentary in and of itself. I understand that, but when companies are seeking to pivot, so to speak, or move into their fast lane or move out of their comfort zone, the fundamentals, as you said, Dave, are still exactly as they were. What are your assets? What do you really bring to the table? How can you change the equation in terms of price versus performance? How can you really show that you can meet demand in a scalable way? All of those things, all of you are dealing with on a continuing basis. I wanted to make that comment because I wanted to elicit from you any last thoughts on this before we go into Q&A and introducing my good friend Juan Espinosa, who I just saw show up briefly on camera. Juan, if you're there, please show yourself. We'd love to see you. And I know you're going to be moderating part of the Q&A as well. So feel free to come in, Juan. But any comments from you folks as a sort of last comments on this notion of dealing constantly with the issue of having to deal, to push against opinion that masquerades as fact?
Yeah,
Dave,
sorry. Just to highlight one thing, I think this whole nature of pivot and dealing with crisis, and I would say that there's there are many ways people deal with crisis, and we've talked about some of them from denying it to ignoring it to facing it head on, and I think that's facing it head on with data. It's facing it head on with a strategy, and so I'm going to argue that hopefully all of us here on screen, but even more importantly, I think everyone else who's out there as an attendee right now, that's already part of the first step, right? It's sort of figuring out how you want to address this, understanding what those strategies are, digging into the data, but also figuring out how do you communicate that in a way effectively that is going to elicit change, whether it's change among your customers, your partners, the regulators, doing it in a way where you've got a clear point, a clear strategy, you stick with it, and I think that ultimately will win. And I know that sounds a little bit naive because I know sometimes it doesn't always happen that way, but you've got nothing but your commitment here to kind of move this forward. And so everyone just keep on doing what you're doing to move this forward.
Well, just to be cute about it, if it doesn't work, pivot. Francis, any comments from you on this issue?
Actually, I'm interested in hearing the questions, so I think I'll just wait and hear what those are.
Thank you. Patty, any last minute thoughts on this, or?
No, not right now, thanks.
Lillian, anything?
I guess I was going to add to what Dave was saying, and the last few months is very hungry.
Your audio is going off, Lillian. We can't hear you too well at all.
All right, that's okay.
Juan, welcome.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for helping us put on this great webinar. Delighted to be involved and actively engaged with West.
Thank you, Rohit, and thank you everybody for all of our panelists, and thank you to everybody who's attending, our 52 attendees on the webinar today. It's really amazing that we're able to pull off this effort together. I'll do a quick introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Juan Espinoza. I am a pediatrician at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I'm currently on inpatient service, which explains the white coat and the scrubs. So rounding on the very patients that we're talking about here on this on the webinar, I'm the director of CTIP. CTIP is the West Coast Consortium for Technology and Innovation in Pediatrics. We are an FDA-funded pediatric medical device accelerator, and we've been working since 2011 to really help advance innovation in pediatric medical devices. It's been our pleasure to partner with Florida Institute and Bioscience LA to put together this webinar, since all three of our organizations have very similar goals in terms of advancing this new technology. Bioscience LA's particular purview as it pertains to Los Angeles, but since we're all based in Los Angeles, this works really well for us. And so this webinar was a great opportunity for us to collaborate. I want to specifically thank our panelists, Lillian and Patty. Thank you so much for sharing your frontline experience as entrepreneurs in this space. Rohit, thank you for moderating the panel. And Dave and Francis, thank you so much for your perspectives from the industry and regulatory side. I think it's really made a big difference, and your contributions have been really helpful. I'm going to see, let's see if we have any questions in the chat. Or in the question box. So for the attendees, if you'd like to type your questions either into the chat box or into the question box, please feel free to do that now. But while we wait for some questions, I have some questions on my own.
Go ahead.
So, one of the things that we've been thinking about is, within our funding mechanism from the FDA, and a lot of grants now have sort of come up either from the private sector or from the nonprofit sector saying, looking at, do you have a response for COVID, a solution for COVID? And for those of us who work in diagnostics and devices, our timelines just are not reasonable to get something out very, very quickly. And so what the FDA has encouraged us to think about is to think about any funding opportunity related to COVID as well. It can be for COVID now, it can be COVID in the future, or any other potential disruption in healthcare in the same way that COVID has done it now. So as you are thinking about your strategies, Patty and Lillian, you talked about having a COVID strategy or an after COVID strategy. Are you thinking about it in that perspective of, well, this isn't just for this specific disease, but this is for any event, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a natural disaster, anything that causes a massive disruption in the way that healthcare is traditionally delivered?
Go ahead, Patty.
Okay, so I think, Juan, I was breaking up a little bit, but I think you're asking about how we can leverage our technology potentially for other big responses. Was that correct? Okay, yeah, great. And it's a great chance that you asked that question, because I know for us, we were really working to try to figure out how do we help our target markets with COVID-19. And in doing that, we've actually figured out a pathway where we'll be able to add many other diseases onto our platform much more quickly. It's sort of the idea of, necessity being the mother of invention. We wanted to do it for COVID, but now we'll be able to do it for other things. And, we all know that this is not the last pandemic, or if you look over the last 10 years even, you're seeing these new diseases emerge, things like Ebola in Africa, SARS, some of them are regional. And I think that we all need to figure out, how can we move faster when we need to? How can we also see a problem in one area and recognize that it may grow, across the world, really thinking more globally for all of us. And also, how can the things that we do for example, we very much design for a environment where it has to be low cost, it has to be easy to use, it may have to work without power. more and more, even here in the U.S., we're in those settings where people have to, save costs. They have to have perhaps a lower trained healthcare worker do things. So, we also look for what can we take from the developing world and move into the developed world. So, we look at all those things that could help us be more responsive in the future. Maybe they'll be taking our unit and doing testing in people's driveways someday. That might be the case.
Great point. Lillian, how about you? I know your audio was giving you trouble, but hopefully it's restored right now. We can't hear you, Lillian.
Myself on mute to help the audio. I have to agree with Patty. Again, our company's been around. We took this out of Princeton University 7 years ago now, which is really amazing. And I can tell you that in that time frame, there's been 2 Ebola epidemics, right? There was the MERS in South Korea, now COVID-2, and early on flu, right? And Zika. And so our strategy all along is get ourselves into the clinic, right? Because maybe we're a little bit behind the timeline to make a difference this time around. But it's not part of our business plan. But I can anticipate that when we are in the clinic, that there'll be something else. And in order to respond to that, we've also been funded by a lot of grants, and we spent this time pivoting on some of those and doing and really because we certainly have an application to address category A, B, and C pathogens. We have a collaboration with USAMRIID. We've thought about, once we are in the clinic, we factored into our plans is how would we scale, right? If the opportunity, that sounds awful to call it an opportunity, but if the situation should arise to be able to respond to emergency use and be there to make a difference.
Great. Thank you, Lillian. Thank you, Patty, for that. I have a question from one of our attendees. The question is around inflection points for pivots. So clearly you were looking at a variety of signals, whether it's from your investors, from your partners, from the data that's coming out of public health. What was it? Where or what data were you looking at, or what feedback were you getting that made you make those decisions to either move into the fast lane, as you described, Patty, Lillian, around the changes that you're making to your strategy? What was the signal that you were listening to, and what was your threshold to say this signal needs to have a higher amplitude?
So did you get that? By the way, there was a little bit of a break up there in the audio from Juan, but I wanted to make sure that the question was well understood. The inflection point issue in terms of signals you were getting that denoted for you an opportunity to respond, or you felt that you needed a much higher threshold in order to respond. Who wants to take that up? Any of you, by the way, folks.
I'll just throw out a little bit with that, and I think to some extent that goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier around importance versus urgency, and really, to that question, making sure you're looking at all of the data points and understanding kind of what's happening, whether it's what your investors are seeing, but certainly what your customers are seeing, what your partners are seeing, looking at all of that and continually basically making that evaluation or that trade-off of you always want to be focusing on the important, which is hopefully a long-term and maybe a lasting solution. But if there's enough that is collecting now where you say we see the urgency and we actually have a viable way to address it, and then I think to Lillian's point, is that something that even if it doesn't apply now, even if we can't bring it to market in this situation, is the funding environment such that people will support it now, knowing that we're working on something that will address the next pandemic, or address the next bottleneck, or even just address the next market growth opportunity, giving people a reason to kind of do it now because we know it will have lasting value.
Lillian or Patty?
Yeah, I think for us, what really was kind of a call to action fairly early on was just really hearing, we're in discussion quite a bit with our different clinical study sites, and hearing from them that they were very worried about what at that point, COVID-19 hadn't come into Africa yet, or even into India, but the idea that if it comes, it's going to be really hard in these societies where they live so close together. The idea of quarantining yourself, in your same house, when you live with 10 people, or you depend on being out on the street to be able to have your income or to even get your food each day. I mean, they knew that it was going to be really hard to prevent against something that was so communicable. So that for us was a warning sign, was when people were very worried about what was going to happen. And honestly, we knew they did not have any of those diagnostics, like, PCR. They don't have a PCR machine at these places. I mean, what are they going to do? They're not going to have a way to diagnose it. So, really, we, by being, in communication, that environment told us that, if we could figure out a way to do something, it was going to be worthwhile. And we were probably one of the few that could meet their needs with the right solution.
Lillian, you have to, your audio is off again.
So interestingly, actually being here in the center here, we have a great biotech incubator space. There's sort of a little bit of a center of excellency around sort of vaccines and virus related companies and stuff. And so actually my call to action was seeing what my fellow entrepreneurs were doing. I mean, and I encourage you, you can be kind of in your little shell, particularly when you're a small company with, a handful of employees, and the environment really did make a difference for us. Seeing what our fellow, we've got diagnostic companies and vaccine companies and so on and so forth doing pivots. So that was a call to action for us.
Have you found that there's been more collaboration in this space, Lillian? It sounds like that's what you're alluding to.
There is. So I had mentioned that I got my blood draw because we have a diagnostic company, Flowmetrics, who's rolled out a antibody test, and as part of the community, they've offered it to those of us on site, right? And so we've had multiple examples of that. Some of them, Zoom. We've been having regular Zoom sort of CEO coffees, right? And hearing about how everybody else was responding. Things like we're doing here definitely made a difference, right? Because you can kind of get into your shell and or I got my grant written and and sort of do your path, and then as you see that those people around you are coming up with clever ways to respond, that was a call to action for us, definitely.
Yeah, it's an obligation on our part as well, Juan and Dave, to look at the pool of folks that we've been working with over many years, right? So we've had 1,100 companies in our commercialization accelerator program since 2004. And to be able to actually promote the opportunity for them to rediscover each other in a time of crisis. So even in this most recent cohort that we've had of 70 companies, 2 of them are already starting to collaborate based on the opportunity created by the crisis. Human models, antibodies, and so on, antibody tests and IgG and so on. One of the things I wanted to just make the point, because it's come up before in the inflection point issue, there are 3 points on the inflection point from our perspective that I think are extremely important. One is it's not just in your mind. Everybody can be a legend in your own mind, and you might be able to consider that to be the signal for you to respond. It has to be an environmental thing, as Lillian was pointing to. You have to look at what's going on in the outside. What are other companies doing? What can you get, as Dave said, from your investors, from your customers, constant talking to them. The second is you've got to be able to look at your own assets. Can you sustain this over time? Because the inflection point is only one point in an entire journey. You still have to sustain it and build and continue to build and continue to be able to respond to opportunities. If you don't have that asset base and you don't have the anticipation of building that asset base around you, it's going to be much more difficult to be responsive in a real and exact way. And the third issue is, who else can you work with? And this is Lillian's point about the collaboration with other folks around you that can help you build a response to an inflection point. So I think those are extremely important interrelated things. I know as entrepreneurs, we tend to think, oh, it's a very lonely place. Nobody can do what I do. I'm just stuck here, as Lillian said, in my own little bubble. But the fact is, it's not a bubble. You are in an environment where there's a lot going on. And if you can't be able to suggest that there is an opportunity for you to be able to add something to what other people are doing, then you really shouldn't be in this business. Patty, you were enthusiastically nodding your head, and I'm always about people who enthusiastically nod their head when I say something.
No, one of the things that we found too, which was amazing, is that we're all people. This is kind of like COVID against humans. So I just found this amazing spirit from people of wanting to help. I mean, we had a device, but we did not have the assay. So we needed to, work with outside partners potentially, on the assay that we could run on our device. I mean, we talked to one of the largest companies in South Korea. They're just like, absolutely, we will send you the test. We reached out to people at University of Washington, where they were doing most of the testing very early on because of the cases that were up in Seattle. And they were like, yes, we will do a grant with you. We'll partner together. I mean, I saw the people just, they came out of their houses to help because, we're in this together. And that is the great thing about a crisis. It's less parochial and more teamwork. And, we really have been gratified by the response that we've gotten.
I really like that comment, Patty. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Richmond.
No, I was just going to say one of the things that resonates with me is the fact that, you can't live on inflection points, and you need data, you need to know the environment. And that really resonated because part of that environment, and one that's very hard to characterize sometimes, is who else is responding to the inflection point. I think sometimes people think, okay, yes, this is my opportunity. And when you hear that there are over 100 vaccines coming into the FDA for COVID, and when you hear that there are these multiplicity of testing platforms that are coming forward, a lot of the big companies are doing stuff and it's submarine. They're not going to talk about what they're doing. It's just not their way to share. So there's a lot of activity that is not just your little world. It's happening across the globe, and characterizing that is also an important part of evaluating that inflection point.
That's a great point, Dr. Richmond. It sounds like pulling a little bit on the thread that both Lillian and Patty were saying is that there have been some, we'll call them positive externalities on the entrepreneurship and innovation community in terms of the approach, and those are good things. So what can we do as both individual players, but then maybe more specifically for organizations like Bioscience LA and LARDA and CTIP to sort of preserve and continue to expand those positive teamwork community approaches that have evolved out of this crisis? Because it sounds like if it helps during this crisis, it probably helps all the time. And so what can we be doing to encourage that moving forward, to keep that? If we pick anything up out of the wreckage of COVID-19, how do we keep that moving forward?
I like to talk about it as wreckage. It's so true. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Just from my end, I think I love that kind of call to action one, and I have seen some really tremendous collaboration going on both here in LA, but also across the country, and these sort of COVID Slacks and various groups that I'm part of, where you see people banding together, and I think what we need is that ongoing flow of it's information, it's success stories that inspire people, but it's also being more open to ask for help. And I think in a kind of hyper competitive sort of normal business as usual world, we don't like to ask for help because either it makes us look weak, or it reveals some competitive intelligence. And so companies are reluctant to do that. And I think even on the academic side, sometimes the research community is reluctant to do that. But if we kind of look at this much bigger picture, longer term, more strategically, where all of us have something to offer and all of us need something, and just finding ways to put that out there through local networks, through distributed networks, and really being more open to seeing where they go and open to collaborations. I think ultimately we can all win. And so this crisis is a perfect opportunity to put that into play, but then let's make sure some of that continues, not least of all just the fact that we all seem more comfortable being on screen and sharing our homes with everyone. So let's keep on doing that in a way where we can actually get closer to each other, whether we're down the street or around the world.
Yeah, like you can all see my very, very messy hospital office.
I mean, I think one of the tough things for us, and I think it will continue to be a problem for a little while, and Juan, hopefully that will change, is that for those of us that are doing clinical trials, they've really been shut down in so many places. I mean, I understand the challenge. It's because of fear of, communicating, the difficulty. But I think we all hope that they will find a way, whether maybe we have to reinvent some of the ways we do these trials so that we can still exist in the in the COVID environment, or while COVID's still going on, because I do worry that if our trials are just getting stopped for months and months, we won't even be able to test our COVID assay if we can't get in to work with teams on that.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Patty. And actually, it's one of the questions in the chat, which is, how do clinical trials change? How do we fundamentally think about doing this differently in a world that will have pandemics every couple of years or every year? How do we do science better?
Maybe Francis could take that. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the areas of interest amongst, sort of clinical trialists has been the use of decentralized or virtual trials. And there's been a lot of, slowness in adopting such trials. But there are elements of hybrid trials like telemedicine or mobile physicians who can come and visit the patient, or, just a variety of options that I think are now going to have to take more hold. So I think people are starting to think harder about, some of the boundary conditions we've placed around clinical trials. You have to come to the hospital. You have to do informed consent in person. You've got to do all these things because they're in the regulations. So there's a place I think we're going to see some movement, and we have to see some movement, not just because of the COVID situation, not just because of pandemics, but because I think the whole way that people are looking at health all of a sudden is starting to shift. And there really are no reasons we can't do it. This morning, I watched a television show where they have a home ultrasound. The patient can do their own ultrasound, and this can be telemetered to the office, and the office can work with them on the ultrasound. We have these technologies, and I think we needed something like this to push us to think in those directions.
Juan, this has been around for a little while, as Francis was suggesting, by the way, not just in a technically ready way, but in a deployed way in rural medicine, for example. But it has never been fully utilized. And now in an urban, dense context, it is going to have to be necessary to do so. Which brings up, by the way, Juan, doesn't it, the issue of telemedicine. And Francis, you may have a comment on this about the regulation around telemedicine. Do you see any regulatory issues coming up as a consequence of decisions that are made based on a telemedical assessment or evaluation or otherwise? I mean, you've already pointed to the issue of clinical trials and how it could be hybridized. Any comments on? Because that's one of the questions.
I think the regulation is perhaps the least of the problems. From the companies that have dealt with the FDA and have asked them if this is okay, they've been very helpful. Companies have been slow to even ask, but the FDA seems to be supportive. I think the areas people have more concerns are, first of all, reimbursement. It can, the doctors need to be reimbursed. In some environments, there are not codes for that. And the legal implications. So physicians and companies want to be cautious going into the exchange of personal information, health information under HIPAA rules over lines that may be corrupted or the other thing is when you get data, you're kind of responsible to act on it. So if you get a lot of data coming into you through telemetry and you don't act on it, and the person then has a heart attack and goes to the hospital and dies, is that your fault? You know, you had that data, you should have acted on that data. So there's going to be some cleaning up that needs to happen in that area.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dr. Richmond. I know that in our experience, usually, FDA has not been really the barrier in telehealth or virtual care. It's sort of CMS and HHS from a billing and coding perspective. And what's interesting there is that there's a really big divide between whether you're a Medicare or Medicaid patient. Medicare has had telehealth rules for a decade. And especially in the rural setting, people have been successfully billing and delivering care at parity, meaning same for inpatient as telehealth, for adult populations in Medicare. Medicaid, which is managed in each individual state and has a completely different set of rules, has been a patchwork. And so in the world of pediatrics, where I live, it's been a real mess. Somewhere the average, I think, in the United States is somewhere between 40 and 50% of the children in the United States get their health care through a Medicaid program. And so you can imagine that almost half of children are dependent on this messy patchwork of, well, this state allows it and this state doesn't, and this state allows it for the public pay patients but doesn't allow it for the private pay patients. So it's really been a mess from the Medicare, Medicaid, CMS angle of things. I am hopeful that this impromptu experiment in telehealth delivery will lead several states to change their approach. Like I said, I think we don't often give Medicare credit, but actually Medicare figured this out a decade ago. And if you happen to be a Medicare beneficiary, you could do it. And then it became a problem of, well, does the patient feel comfortable and have access to the technology, and does the provider feel comfortable and have access? Yeah, it's been fascinating to see the rapid evolution with the 1135 waiver that was issued to basically remove the HIPAA requirements. I think that'll go away as soon as the emergency ends.
One hope.
But I think the overall approach to parity and to payments, I think that's here to stay. And several states, including the state of California, have passed parity laws where now by law, payers are required to pay the same for telehealth as they are in person.
So Juan, there's a question for you, by the way, which if you don't mind if I turn the tables on you a little bit, that said, medtech entrepreneurs usually innovate and develop products in the adult space. During this time, are there additional considerations for those developing devices in the pediatric space? I mean, obviously, this is against the context also of some interesting insights that are coming in during the COVID-19 pandemic on kids, and in particular, the proxy Kawasaki condition that afflicted a bunch of kids in the Northeast. Your comments on innovations driving development in the pediatric space.
Yeah. Oh, man. Pediatrics, starved for attention, dollars, and innovation.
But kids are future, Juan. Don't you know that? I mean, my gosh, right?
I certainly have heard it from enough people. I haven't seen enough checks to back it up.
Yeah.
I think the reality is it's always a little bit harder. So some of the difficulties are around just basic, science, engineering, and mechanics, right? Smaller things are harder to make; they're more expensive to make. I'm gonna pick up my phone to reduce some of the volume here. Look, guys, a phone. But yeah, so there are some basic scientific and mechanical and engineering issues that are hard to overcome. But a lot of the issues, honestly, are market forces. In the United States, we spend less than 10% of all of our healthcare dollars, all 17 trillion of them, on pediatrics, even though Americans under the age of 21 are a quarter of the U.S. population. So we're spending 10% of our dollars on 25% of our population. And the same can be said in the investment space and in the innovation space. So they're just, the resources aren't there. It's also not there from the NIH, right? Only about $3 billion of the NIH's $35 billion a year budget is actually spent in supporting any kind of pediatric research. So again, we don't fund research, we don't fund the care delivery, we don't invest in the startups, and so the problem is systematic. I think the opportunities are to look at how can you use pediatrics as a use case and then pivot into the adult space. So I think that that's a great opportunity. And the FDA recently started exploring what a new program, which is not official and not public yet, but it's an early stage exploration, something they're calling reverse extrapolation. So for those of you who are familiar with extrapolation, it's the idea that the FDA will take adult data and then apply a series of Rube Goldberg algorithms to extrapolate to what might be safe for pediatrics. And the concept now is to help encourage pediatric innovation is to create a reverse extrapolation, that if you can get your pediatric product approved, you can use your pediatric data to reverse extrapolate to adult safety data. And so the idea is come through the pediatrics door and then we'll get you into adults.
Wow, that's so remarkable, Juan. There's a couple of questions here. I know we couldn't get to everything, but two fundamental and very big questions that are potentially the opportunity for another webinar itself, which I believe, based on the enthusiasm we're generating here among ourselves, we're all legends in our own mind here, and we can certainly have another webinar on a whole range of other topics. But two things here, whether in fact this crisis will reveal the opportunity to be more attentive to counterintuitive ideas. My initial reaction would be great as long as we don't propose hydro whatever that thing is. Quinn, I won't even mention it. But also fundamentally, whether in fact, based on the comments that we made earlier about the .com bust, whether in fact the notion of knowledge in health and biology will drive potentially new ways of dealing with risk, given the fact that the FDA is considered to be risk averse. And I know those are large questions. We don't have the time to get to them. But clearly, all the panelists are here and available to you. If you're willing to entertain specific questions, panelists, please feel free to let us know, and we'll try and develop with Juan and his team and Dave an opportunity to be the sort of filter, if you don't mind, Juan. But this is
absolutely
remarkable. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, thank you. Well, so first, we'll maybe, given being respectful of everyone's time, and it's 12:31, we'll let maybe each of our panelists give us maybe some closing thoughts, and then I'll do a little bit of wrap up and next steps for everybody. But we'll start with you, Dr. Richmond.
You're on mute, Dr. Richmond. Please, yeah.
And probably just as well on mute, because there have been so many ideas presented that any form of summary would be difficult. But I do think that, we have to look in the short term, but also keep a very long-term vision. And that is that at the end of this, we need to learn lessons, but we also need, I think, to be sure that we're dealing with the problems that we had before the crisis as well, and not lose sight of those.
Thank you. I appreciate you bringing that up, Dr. Richmond. Dave.
Well, this has been great, and I think just I'll keep it short. But in the true spirit of pivot and win, I feel like we've taken this conversation so many different directions just in the past 90 minutes, and that's really a great example of pivoting and adjusting. And then just to echo what Francis said, I think it's. Let's not lose sight of the big picture, big problems, and keep focusing on those.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. Lillian.
I was going to say that what I've learned in this session, we've talked about what might change, right? Telemedicine, diagnostics, and because I'm in therapeutics, and we know that that's a product timeline that has a long line. It's made me reflect and maybe not think so much about COVID-19 per se and how I respond to that, but that yes, that COVID-19 is going to change how we do things. And given the long timeline on the types of products I'm trying to develop, I try to think in that frame of mind. Let's say 5 or 10 years from now, when I really have a product on the market, how I might anticipate, some of the things that are essentially going to grow up, some of the things to our system that are going to grow out of this. Yeah.
Great, and that's a great lesson, I think, for all of us. Patty.
Well, I think that, we've all experienced in the last month or so how, healthcare has changed everybody's day-to-day life, right? We're locked in our houses, we have to work in different ways. And I'm just hopeful that, we'll get more entrepreneurs into this healthcare space as a result of what's happened. More people that'll work on pediatric problems, telehealth problems. I mean, there's still a lot of issues to be solved. We can't trace people. We can't contact trace people. We need more innovation to be able to deal with these kind of situations. And so I hope this is going to inspire a lot of entrepreneurs to get in there with their ideas, and we'll be better off because, we can't wait around for the government to come up with an idea. It's got to come from the entrepreneurial community. So I am excited. I say we need a lot of great ideas, and not all of them will work, but if even some of them do, we have a good chance.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Patty. Well, on behalf of Rohit and myself, I want to say thank you again to all of our panelists for their insights, their time, their expertise. I especially want to thank Judy and Josefina from the LARDA team, as well as Nadine, Salima, and Ernesto from the CTIP team. The 5 of them worked together to make this possible. And so thank you so much to our unspoken heroes who they're just little names on the attendee boxes, but they did so much to make it possible for us to be here. So thank you to all of you. Bioscience LA, LARDA Institute, CTIP are all resources for the community. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're accessible through our websites, through social media, through LinkedIn. If anyone needs anything, we're here to help. The worst thing that'll happen is we'll say we don't know either. But if we don't, we probably know somebody who does. So please reach out. For all of the attendees, we'll be emailing you a brief feedback form over the next few days to let us know what we did well, what worked, what didn't, what we can do better in the future. And if you have follow-up questions, you're more than welcome to email them to us, and we will work with our panelists to get you answers. With that, thank you again to everyone. Thank you to everyone who attended. Good luck out there. Stay healthy and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all my panelists. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Go ahead for moderating.
Thank you, Juan. Appreciate the opportunity. Nadine and everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks
Bye.
We can keep staring at each other's faces here.